Thank you very much. I'm going to start very quickly just looking at some data on access to cancer drugs in Europe. This is a study by the European Society of Medical Oncologists, and it was published last year. And I guess it's sort of, I'm going to skip ahead to do a few of these things, and explain a little bit how these charts work. I'm going to go to, this one is, this is stage 4 breast cancer. And they're looking at 4 drugs for HER2 positive breast cancer, which is what my wife has, and then another one which is triple positive hormonal treatment. The way these charts are done is that if there's a slide that is the availability of the products, in theory, like whether or not the drug is reimbursed or not, and this is actual availability. It's a little worse. And if you're in a country where it's blue, that means the drug is generally available. If you're a country where it's green, it's sort of available. Dark green is a little bit worse. And if you're in orange, it's rarely available. And if it's black or red, you're not going to get the drug at all. This is for prostate cancer. This is what happens when drugs are off patent. Almost everyone gets almost every drug when drugs are off patent. These are older cancer drugs, and these other graphs are newer cancer drugs. Is it okay if we switch to the other slide now? I think I'm through with this one. Thank you. I just show you this because I think cancer is, I think, a disease that everybody in this room is probably touched in some way. I mean, I think everybody has a relative or a friend or knows somebody, maybe even themselves, that has had cancer. And I think you can remember when you learn about something like that, just what a traumatic thing it is to hear, that you've been diagnosed with cancer, or to watch someone die from cancer. The treatments are getting better and better. There's been a wave of new innovation. There's a new technology, CAR-T technology, that for some types of cancer that are thought to be incurable is considered to be not just a treatment, but effectively a cure. We'll wait and see if that plays out that way, but that's what it looks like right now. My wife takes D4T. It costs $3,000 per week for the drug. Right now, I think we were billed $5,000 a week about 2 years ago, so it's almost a bargain now. That drug is not reimbursed in Scotland. It's not reimbursed in several European countries. It's pretty much unavailable in developing countries. It's a combination of 3 older drugs based on a patent from a company that worked on an NIH grant. It was then licensed to Roche, and it's extremely expensive. There's great inequality in access to cancer drugs in Eastern Europe, in developing countries, in Central Europe, and even in northern parts of Europe and the United States. So the idea that I've been working on for some time with a number of other people is to change the business model for the development of new drugs. And today I'm going to focus on how that's being played out in the area of cancer drugs. I'm going to first talk about linkage, because this is a conversation. I'm going to use this term delinkage, but before I get to delinkage, I guess I have to talk about linkage. We use the term linkage because right now, how do you finance research and development and new drugs? Well, partly through government grants and things like that, but the primary thing that moves most of the money for research and development is the fact that if you register a new cancer drug and you get patents or other intellectual property on it, you can have a monopoly, and then you can price it as high as you want for a period of, typically the monopoly might last in recent years about maybe 15 years on a drug before the patents expire. Longer in some cases and shorter in other cases. Now, during that period of time, companies are very aggressive about how they price it, and if a government or insurance company wants to deal with a high price, what they typically do is they make a decision: do I reimburse a drug, or not reimburse the drug. And the leverage you have on pricing, if you're the UK, nice. If you're the Polish, whoever is a reimbursement entity here or in any other country, you make a decision. Do people get access to the drug or not? And so the patient is essentially a hostage in the price negotiations. It's often the case that new cancer drugs have a period of time when there's very restricted access, and then it gets some partial access in some countries, not other countries. They'll narrow the purposes under which you can use the drug. It'd be hard to use it off-label. You may, in some countries, have high co-payments. Uninsured people won't get access at all. And the developing world usually gets practically nothing. Over time, eventually that drug will become a generic drug and they'll be more widely available. So we'd like to change that system because we don't like that. And there's a lot of other flaws in the system, which are that last paragraph, which I don't have time to explain. So what's delinkage? It's the opposite of linkage. It's defined in the negative. It's anything you do to finance drug development. It doesn't involve the granting of exclusive rights on the products. And among people that are pushing for this right now, and there's a growing number of people that are exploring this issue, including 16 members of the United States Senate. I was at a meeting in the European Parliament on this very proposal that I'm going to present today, Tuesday of this week. In May of this year, the World Health Assembly debated about whether to do a feasibility study of this particular project. There was a UN commission that was appointed by the Secretary General to discuss the policy incoherence between the objective of universal access to drugs and the mechanisms you have to finance the development of new drugs. If high prices are the way that you finance new drug development, but you also want to have universal access, those two goals are in conflict. And so this UN commission also recommended movements in this direction. The problem is, in some ways, is that there's so much freedom and delinkage about how you do it. That's a good thing in a way. You can be creative. You're not really, don't have to do it a particular way. You can just have a massive program of government grants. You can put up big, huge amounts of money as cash rewards. You can try something else. But one of the challenges in replacing an existing system is you have to replace it with something in particular. You can't replace it with anything. There was this Civil War story where President Lincoln was asked to fire General McClellan in the United States during the Civil War. And a senator wrote him and he said, I'd like you to fire General McClellan. He's horrible, or a group of senators. And President Lincoln said, well, who should I replace General McClellan with? And one of the senators wrote back and he said, anyone would be better than General McClellan. And then President Lincoln wrote back and he says, that's the difference between you as a senator and me as a president. He says, as a president, I have to replace General McClellan with somebody. I can't replace him with anybody. I have to replace him with someone. And that's the true with the current system. You cannot replace a dysfunctional, unfair, wasteful, expensive, completely corrupt system that you have today with anything. You have to replace it with something. And one of the challenges has been to get a consensus among the reformers as to what that new alternative looks like. And I'd have to say it's turned out to be a little bit more challenging than I had anticipated. The main elements for funding biomedical R&D under delinkage are the following. The first is I would just describe as expanding the conventional push mechanisms. Now, push and pull are terms that are used among the policy wonks in this area. What they describe is what people talk about as push mechanisms are things that, regardless of whether or not you know whether something's going to succeed or not, someone's going to pay for it. So if you get a government grant to do research, or you get a contract with a government agency to do research, we refer to those as direct funding of research. Those are quite important, particularly for earlier stages of research, but they happen in all stages of research for different products. But direct funding is a really important area, and it's kind of underfunded right now. And one of the reasons it's underfunded is because, well, if you think of the IP world as having a national dimension, you have copyright and patent laws, but you don't really just wake up in the morning as a country and say, do I want to have a patent law that looks a particular way? You have to go along with international rules. There's treaties about this. There's trade agreements. You have to grant patents, and you have to give them a 20-year term. It's not true for grants. You don't have to do anything on grants. That's just a total free space. There's no national obligation to fund research in that way. And same thing is true with subsidies. The second element that's important, because if you're going to get rid of the incentive that the patent system provides, you have to replace it with something that moves money to research, or you won't have innovation, and people won't let that happen. You will not replace the current system that's producing over 50 drugs in the last 6 years for cancer with nothing. So the most controversial thing is to reform the system of incentives. And by that, I mean the exclusive rights you get when something becomes a product that somebody uses. The primary reform is to replace the grant of the monopoly with money that you grant. You give. Some people refer to these as market entry rewards. Some people refer to them as prize or money from an innovation prize fund or innovation inducement prizes. But the idea is that giving someone a monopoly is really a means for that person to get money and a profit from their invention. But you can just get rid of the monopoly right off the bat and just say, write checks. I mean, that's the basic idea. And that the idea that you can do away with the monopoly and still reward investors is an important idea. But it requires a commitment to really robust funding of the reward system. And then you have to think about reforming the international norms. The Cancer Innovation Fund was a particular an effort to specify this in particular ways. It was presented in January of this year in the margins of the World Health Organization's executive board. It's a tough area to work in terms of implementing these ideas about delinkage, because there's lots of different kinds of cancers, and there's a large number of drugs. So I would describe this as probably the toughest area to test whether you can implement delinkage in the pharmaceutical area. If you might be able to do it much easier, for example, with HIV drugs or hepatitis drugs. We're a small number of products, and it's just less complicated. But also, the benefits of doing it are quite large here. If you think that the whole idea of delinkage is that you get rid of monopolies, there's a whole set of areas in different ways you can get money to people that develop drugs. And I started out by mentioning direct funding through grants. I think some people would like the governments to just do a lot more direct funding. Dean Baker and other people would like the government just to fund everything. The counter argument is that you don't really want to rely upon a government bureaucracy to decide what targets to fund and what not to fund. You can look, for example, at the success or lack of success by the Gates Foundation, which acts almost like a government because it's so huge in its space and the targets it's worked at. They've put a lot of money into drug development, and they've had very little success in terms of actually developing new products. So it's not because you spend a lot of money, profit or non-profit, that you're necessarily going to succeed. So there's an interest in having a system that involves a role for entrepreneurs, where different people that don't think alike, that think differently, that take chances and have some of their own skin in the game, that have some of their own investment in the game, take chances on things, would play a role in the development of a new product. And that's why we think that the incentive systems, I think the incentive systems are important, and to reform, not just to get rid of. So instead of saying that you just have the government fund everything, we'd say that the government should fund more than it does now, and you should enhance government funding of research and probably have deeper subsidies in things like clinical trials to make the cost of the private sector less costly for them to make the investments. But you still want them to be guided by the fact that if they fail, they lose money, because that focuses the attention of the drug developers in important areas, and also provide an area for independent action. The challenge that people had initially on this side in doing this was just some skepticism of whether you could design a reward system that itself was not as flawed as the current system. But what was introduced back initially in 2005 by Senator, who's now a Senator, Bernie Sanders, and has been emulated by a large number of other actors since, is the notion that you create a fund to reward development of a fixed size based in his proposal by a percentage of GDP, and by an official in Thailand they'd proposed as a fraction of, say, the treatment budget for cancer or something. And then when a drug developer is successful, they become eligible to get money out of the fund. And they retain that eligibility for a period of 10 years. So you don't even have to know that much information in the first year, because you're essentially participating in a payoff over 10 years. And during that 10-year period of time, you have information from how good the drug is every year. So you participate in this fund for a 10-year period. You compete against other drug developers. And so what you get depends on what everyone else gets. So if you get more, somebody else gets less. It's a zero-sum allocation among groups. And so the actual award that any particular drug developer gets is based on the evidence that their product improves healthcare outcomes, not just matches them, but actually improves them. And it's a relative payout compared to other people trying to do the same thing. The fundamental idea is that the invention is a public good. It's freely copyable. Anybody can make the product, but you have data on the utilization of the product, even though the developer is not the seller. The developer is, the person that gets the first copy on the market, and then the generic sector really takes over from there. The open source dividend is another component of this, and that is that some of the revenue that goes to the drug developer doesn't go to the developer himself. It goes to the people that the developer relied upon and benefited from, people who would open source their technology early on in the drug development stage. To be eligible for this, you have to have non-discriminatory access, royalty-free, to knowledge, materials, technologies, and data. And so there's a business decision. If you're a scientist or a company, you can either try and go the proprietary route and come up with a product and license it yourself, or you can open source it. If you don't open source it, you can't get money out of the open source fund. So it's an economic incentive to be open and to share. And that's designed to make things more open, and also to have society put its money where its mouth is in terms of how it values openness. This is a slide on the transition. One of the issues that's involved is this is a super important thing of anything that involves moving from an embedded system like we have right now to a new system, and a fair amount of work is being done on transition strategies, which in my opinion are quite feasible. The primary incentive for countries, the Cancer Innovation Fund was designed as a club of like-minded countries moving together. And just checking on the time there. I've got it. Like-minded countries moving together. There has to be a big enough club of countries moving together that the market would be sufficiently large to induce competitive entry by generic suppliers for a large number of drugs. So one country like Poland would have a hard time itself moving ahead and doing this without any other countries working together on it. And one of the parts of this being done right now in terms of a feasibility study is how big the market would have to be to make it work. You'd have, by being a member, you'd have less political pressure on things you did to lower drug prices, because you would not be perceived as free riding, because you wouldn't be free riding. And you'd have an opportunity to have more effective mechanisms to finance innovation. This is my last slide. I think I made it. There's going to be more meetings on the terms of reference for the Cancer Innovation Fund. At first, the WHO was really opposed to doing a feasibility study because they didn't really know what anyone was asking them to do. They didn't really understand. The concept was so different. It was the idea that you fund research as a public good. And by the way, from my point of view, unless you do this, unless you change the business model, you will never have equal access to new cancer drugs. You'll never have fairness. You'll never have universal access. And the populations are getting older and prices are getting higher. The new CAR-T technology rolled out at $475,000 a treatment. The drug my wife costs is $150,000 US per year. The latest new lung cancer drug I looked at was $177,000 per year. The prices are twice as high now as they were about 7 years ago. Things are getting worse, they're not getting better, and the population's getting older. You cannot solve the inequality you've got. You're going to end up with more inequality, not less inequality, unless you do something radical. So part of the feasibility study is forcing people to say what the current system will look like in 2030. and what the delinkage system would do, and compare the two straight up. How much are they going to cost? Who's going to get the drugs? What's access going to look like? How it's going to affect innovation? I'm getting the timeout sign, and I think that's correct. Thank you very much.